Welcome to ASP Stuff Radio, the internet radio show that is not afraid to shed light on things that the corporate lamestream media will only keep hidden deep inside the Earth's inner core, where it's too hot to retrieve. Today is Friday, June 7th. I'm your host and wannabe special counsel, Alberotle. Stevocrates and Paleto are on assignment, conducting research on the effects that the extreme temperature of the Earth's inner core has on those doing research on the Earth's inner core. This episode is a continuation of the Alberotle report on the corrupt foundation of Russiagate, a 4-part series and deep dive analysis of the Trump-Russia collusion conspiracy. Part 2 will cover substantial ground where I will critically examine the George Papadopoulos case, the one that triggered Operation Crossfire Hurricane, which was later taken over by special counsel Robert Mueller. I will also explicate the genesis of the infamous Steele dossier and highlight a genuine example of unlawful collusion or conspiracy with the Russian government. Before I begin, if you enjoyed this episode or any of our previous episodes, please support our small independent podcast on our website, aspstuffradio.com, or directly at paypal.me/ASP Stuff Radio donate. Your contributions will help us keep producing more informative and entertaining stuff for your listening pleasure. Thank you for your support. Part 4. Propagate the narrative.
You demonize, and then we call it the wrap-up smear. If you want to talk politics, you call it the wrap-up smear. You smear somebody with falsehoods and all the rest, and then you merchandise it. And then you write it, and they'll say, see, it's reported in the press that this, and this, so they have that validation that the press reported the smear, and then it's called the wrap-up smear. Now I'm going to merchandise the press's report on the smear that we made. And it's a tactic.
The conclusions of Mueller's report raises 2 pressing questions. 1. If there was no evidence that the Trump campaign colluded or coordinated with Russia to sway the 2016 U.S. presidential election against Clinton, then what was the basis of the Russia investigation? What was the substantial evidence, if any, that served as the catalyst to embark on a 2-year, $25 million inquiry on alleged conspiratorial ties with the Russian government? 2. If there was no evidence of Trump-Russia collusion, then the narrative was a groundless political witch hunt, or fake news. So, should the talking heads, pundits, and government officials who claimed there was collusion be held accountable for propagating a false narrative on national news organizations? The answer to the first question is complex and the main focus of the Alberotle report. The answer to the second question is simple. Anyone who wrongly accuses someone of a crime without evidence should be held morally and legally accountable. A good journalist should always abide by a high standard of ethics when thoroughly seeking and obtaining the facts of a story, and report it without spin. Good journalists have a duty to critically inform the public, and to do so with objectivity and integrity. Instead, American citizens experienced 2 years of bad corporate media journalists and self-serving talking heads who disseminated and perpetuated baseless lies and misinformation on the Russia probe. To sample some of this fallacious shoddiness, here's an audio clip of various media outlets that, like the Italian philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli once said, use words to veil the facts.
Does the public understand just how much trouble the president is in?
To believe that the president isn't compromised requires such a leap of faith.
I think we have all the proof we need of a scandal that's arguably worse than Watergate.
Do we know if there is still this belief and aspect that the president is working for the Russians? I can't answer that.
The U.S. president possibly working for the Russians. Possibly an unwitting pawn.
Now, here's what the president said when asked if he was a secret Russian agent.
The president did not directly answer the question.
Why not just say no, if that's the answer?
There is tons of proof of potential collusion.
We have dramatic evidence of collusion.
How is it not collusion? How is all of that not collusion?
The collusion piece of this, piece by piece, starting to be built out.
A political hurricane is out there at sea for him. We'll call it Hurricane Vladimir, if you will.
Donald Trump knows
The noose is tightening.
The noose is tightening.
The noose is tightening, if you will.
The noose is tightening around the president.
The noose is tightening. And I think they're shocked that the noose is tightening and that people might go to jail.
He knows he and POTUS are going to prison.
Well, I think they're all going to end up together in prison, and maybe that's a good thing.
Oh, my God.
You might be in legal jeopardy because of the Mueller investigation. But are you scared that you could go to jail?
The walls appear to be closing in on the president.
The investigative walls are closing in.
He feels the walls closing in.
The walls are closing in.
Trump resigns, quote, once Mueller closes in on him and the family.
Anybody that writes an op-ed and suggests that Donald Trump has not put himself directly in the target of an obstruction charge is just fooling themselves and some very, very stupid, ill-informed readers.
The stack of counts of obstruction of justice that could be fatal to the Trump presidency.
The House is going to have little choice the way this is going other than to start impeachment proceedings.
The subpoena could relate to two areas of the probe that might ultimately lead to Trump's impeachment.
They are the kind of offenses that would call for impeachment hearings.
If someone walked in my office and said I was a subject of a multi-year criminal investigation led by former FBI Director Robert Mueller, I'd wet my pants.
Mueller reminds me of the starfish, which gets itself tightly around the clam and uses all its stuff to weaken and pry open the clam. Now, this is a battle to the death as far as the clam is concerned. If the starfish is able to open him even a little bit, he can get him open all the way, and that's it, of course, for the clam. He's the starfish's lunch.
This is sloppy journalism at its finest. The next clip is my favorite. It's a creative compilation of sound bites that nicely illustrates the mass media's goal to ensnare and influence the audience with carefully crafted catchphrases that were regurgitated across virtually every major news outlet.
Donald Trump's done. He's done. There's no question about that. He's done.
Breaking news.
A bombshell.
Today is a turning point. Today was historically bad for President Trump.
Today was a turning point.
A turning point.
We're at a turning point here.
The beginning of the end for the Trump presidency.
The beginning of the end.
And breaking news.
We have another bombshell.
Mike Pence might have to assume the office of the presidency.
The call for impeachment.
Rumblings of the word impeachment.
Breaking news.
Another bombshell out of the White House.
I believe this is the beginning of the end.
I do too.
It's really the beginning of the end.
The beginning of the end.
He may be feeling the walls closing in on him.
All the walls closing in on him.
The walls closing in on him.
Breaking news, a new bombshell.
One astrologer says this means the beginning of the end for President Donald Trump.
The beginning of the end of the Trump presidency.
Trump will resign.
Trump is going to resign.
Is this the tipping point? I know we've said it over and over.
You think this is a tipping point?
And over and over.
This is a tipping point.
And over and over.
Breaking news, President Trump off the rails.
It was the beginning of the end today.
The beginning of the end.
It reminds me a lot of the last days of Nixon.
Breaking news tonight, new bombshell.
This is the beginning, not the end.
The beginning of the end.
The walls are closing in.
The walls closing in.
The walls closing in.
Breaking overnight bombshell.
This is a very dramatic day, and I think it might be near a tipping point. Do you think this is a tipping point?
This is unbelievable. This is remarkable. Have you ever seen anything like this?
His presidency is crippled.
December 1st, 2017, you can mark it down. This is the day that everything changed.
We begin with the bombshell.
The beginning of the end?
The beginning of the end.
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 In fact, if this were a football game, we're in the third quarter. May even be the beginning of the end.
We begin tonight with the bombshell. Donald Trump is in a lot of trouble.
Trump is in trouble.
The president will resign.
Another hour, another bombshell.
This is a tipping point.
Trump's going down.
This president could be impeached.
I do not think the president will serve out his term. Resignation. I don't think this president is going to serve out his term. Mr. Trump will not serve out his term. He will not serve out his term. No way. No how.
Breaking news.
Absolute bombshell.
I think Donald Trump is in trouble.
Donald Trump is not. He's done. And it's over. It's over.
The walls closing in.
The walls closing in.
This is going to be the Achilles heel.
Breaking news tonight. I expect Trump to depart.
This week will be the watershed week.
Trump is in big trouble.
Trump's in a lot of trouble.
It's a sign of a terrified old man who feels the
walls
closing in.
The walls
Are increasingly
Closing in on him.
Tonight, the walls
are closing in.
today changed everything. This is the beginning
of the end.
Today, the biggest
Tipping
tipping point for the Trump administration.
What a historic day. The bombshells, they fell.
It's entropy and it's crumbling internally.
He's underwater. He feels the walls closing in.
Could his testimony be a turning point?
We may be at a tipping point.
It's the beginning of
the end. The beginning
of the end.
Another bombshell.
Bombshell. Bombshell. Bombshell. Bombshell.
Bombshell.
Bombshell.
bombshell.
This is a bombshell.
It is a bombshell.
I am beginning to resent the word bombshell.
According to a research report in Psychology, information that is constantly repeated is more likely to be deemed true than information that has not been heard before. This phenomenon is called the illusory truth effect, or the reiteration effect, and it was first identified in a 1977 study at Villanova University and Temple University. People tend to believe information to be true after repeated exposure, even if the information is incorrect or false. Perhaps that is why the masses have been easily duped into believing this fake corporate media news story about the Trump campaign colluding with Russian government officials. The study also indicates that new information will most likely be judged false simply because it is relatively new and the brain is not quick to process that information, even if it is factually true. Sticking with the theme of repetition, here's a clip of Rachel Maddow, an American television host and liberal political commentator, mentioning Russia or things related to Russia in a single show.
Russia, Vladimir Putin. Russia hates Russia, Putin, Russian, Moscow, Russian, pro-Russian, Russian, Moscow, Russia, Putin, Russia against us, Russians, rush against the U.S., the Russian government scheme, the Russians, Vladimir Putin, Russia, Putin and Russia, Moscow, Russia, the Russians, Putin, Russia, the Soviet Empire, the second of the 20th century's great evils, communism, communism, Russia, assault by Russia,
Putin despises the West in general and the United States in particular, the Soviet Empire. Russia. They're the adversary. They want to bring us down, the Soviet Union.
Russia.
Undermine the West, Soviet communists on the left.
Russia. That does it for us tonight.
Imagine listening to the best of compilation of Maddow saying Russia and Putin from all of her past shows since the scandal first broke on the airwaves. For 2 years, the public has been inundated with exaggerated claims about a conspiracy to overthrow an election. Even the extreme view that Trump acted as a Russian agent and committed treason, which is a serious crime punishable by death. This outlandish accusation was tweeted by John Brennan, the former CIA director under the Obama administration, after the Helsinki summit where Trump and Putin were at a joint press conference. Trump was asked whether he trusted his own U.S. intelligence community or Putin regarding the Kremlin's alleged meddling in the 2016 U.S. election.
Just now, President Putin denied having anything to do with the election interference in 2016. Every U.S. intelligence agency has concluded that Russia did. My first question for you, sir, is who do you believe? My second question is, would you now, with the whole world watching, tell President Putin, would you denounce what happened in 2016, and would you warn him to never do it again?
So let me just say that we have two thoughts. You have groups that are wondering why the FBI never took the server. Why haven't they taken the server? Why was the FBI told to leave the office of the Democratic National Committee? I've been wondering that. I've been asking that for months and months, and I've been tweeting it out and calling it out on social media. Where is the server? I want to know, where is the server, and what is the server saying? With that being said, all I can do is ask the question. My people came to me, Dan Coates came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be.
The mainstream media only highlighted this portion of Trump's response. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I don't see any reason why it would be. What was not reported in conjunction with the latter is critical. You have groups that are wondering why the FBI never took the DNC server. Why haven't they taken the server? Why was the FBI told to leave the office of the Democratic National Committee? Why was the FBI told to leave the office of the Democratic National Committee? I've been wondering that. In fact, we've all been wondering that. Would this not be one reason why we might question U.S. intelligence?
What happened to the server? What happened to the servers of the Pakistani gentlemen that worked on the DNC? Where are those servers? They're missing. Where are they? What happened to Hillary Clinton's emails? 33,000 emails, gone, just gone.
Naturally, gaskets were blown as a result of Trump's rightful criticism, and pundits took the opportunity to pontificate. Brennan responded in a tweet stating that Trump's press conference performance in Helsinki rises to and exceeds the threshold of high crimes and misdemeanors. It was nothing short of treasonous.
But what Mr. Trump did yesterday was to betray the women and men of the FBI, the CIA, NSA, and others, and to betray the American public. And that's why I use the term that this is nothing short of treasonous, because it is a betrayal of the nation. He is giving aid and comfort to the enemy, and it needs to stop. And Mr. Trump needs to understand that there are going to be consequences for him, too. And I do hope that those who voted for Mr. Trump, in good conscience, are going to see that he is leading us down a very dangerous path. And it is a dangerous path. And what we don't want is for Mr. Putin to walk away from that meeting thinking that he can get away now with whatever he wants. And I still shake my head trying to understand what was discussed during the 2-hour one-on-one. And what was discussed between the two sides in their bilateral meeting. We only saw what Mr. Trump said during the press conference. I can't even imagine what he said behind closed doors. I can't imagine what he said to Mr. Putin directly. I am very concerned about what type of impact it might have on our intelligence community and on this country.
A former CIA director audaciously claims that Trump, the President of the United States, committed an act of treason on the basis that he distrusts the U.S. Intelligence Department, or that he met with another foreign leader to discuss issues which Brennan equivocates as giving the enemy aid and comfort? This is a weak argument. First, you can't commit treason if the United States is not currently at war with Russia. Second, meeting with a foreign leader of an unfriendly nation is not a treasonous act in and of itself. Was it treasonous when Trump met with Kim Jong-un, who actually poses a real threat to the United States? FDR once met with Stalin, and JFK spoke to Khrushchev, the former leader of the Soviet Union who brought the world close to nuclear war. Were these US presidents also traitors? Therefore, aside from misrepresenting the President of the United States as a Russian agent, what reason does Brennan have for accusing Trump for betraying his country?
You're listening to ASP Stuff Radio.
Here are several more quotes from Democratic senators and representatives who made implausible claims about the Trump-Russia collusion scandal. Adam Schiff: I think there's plenty of evidence of collusion or conspiracy in plain sight. Richard Blumenthal: the evidence is pretty clear that there was collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians. Gerald Nadler: there was obviously a lot of collusion. The question is how high? Every day we get new information about involvement. Eric Swalwell: in our investigation, we saw strong evidence of collusion. And finally, DNC Chairman Tom Perez on NBC: over the course of the last year, we have seen, I think, a mountain of evidence of collusion between the campaign and the Russians to basically affect our democracy. Given the conclusion of Mueller's report that there was no proof of collusion or conspiracy, it is very disturbing that these government officials knowingly and willingly misled the American public for political gain, and to do it on news networks that allowed these pundits to broadcast their false allegations. Part 5. George Papadopoulos, the Fall Guy. Before there was the special counsel investigation headed by Robert Mueller, there was Operation Crossfire Hurricane, which began on July 31st, 2016, as a covert FBI counterintelligence investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. elections run by former FBI Director James Comey. The codename for the operation was inspired by a lyric in the Rolling Stones song Jumpin' Jack Flash. The case that triggered Crossfire involved Trump's then campaign advisor, George Papadopoulos, a Trump associate who allegedly acted as an intermediary or link between Trump and Russia that served as evidence of collusion. Although the claim has been proven false, Papadopoulos was indicted for lying to FBI agents about the timing of his contacts and sentenced to 12 days in federal prison. I will read the relevant parts of the Papadopoulos case from the Mueller report and point out vital information that was not reported. George Papadopoulos was a foreign policy advisor to the Trump campaign from March 2016 to early October 2016. Approximately a week after signing on as a foreign policy advisor, Papadopoulos traveled to Rome, Italy. During the visit, Papadopoulos was introduced to Joseph Mifsud, a Maltese national who worked as a professor at the London Academy of Diplomacy in London, England. According to Papadopoulos, Mifsud at first seemed uninterested in him when they met, but after Papadopoulos informed Mifsud about his role in the Trump campaign, Mifsud appeared to take greater interest in Papadopoulos. The two discussed Mifsud's European and Russian contacts and had a general discussion about Russia. Mifsud also offered to introduce Papadopoulos to European leaders and others with contacts to the Russian government. Papadopoulos told the office that Mifsud's claim of substantial connections with Russian government officials interested Papadopoulos, who thought that such connections could increase his importance as a policy advisor to the Trump campaign. On March 21, 2016, Papadopoulos met with Mifsud in London, where he was accompanied by a Russian female named Olga Polanskaya. Mifsud introduced Polanskaya as a former student of his who had connections to Vladimir Putin. Papadopoulos understood at the time that Polanskaya may have been Putin's niece, but later learned that this was not true. During the meeting, Polanskaya offered to help Papadopoulos establish contacts in Russia and stated that the Russian ambassador in London was a friend of hers. Based on this interaction, Papadopoulos expected Mifsud and Polanskaya to introduce him to the Russian ambassador in London, but that did not occur. Here, Mueller fails to be explicit. Mifsud intentionally lied to Papadopoulos that Polanskaya was Putin's niece. Instead, she is the manager of a Russian wine company, and her relatives have absolutely nothing to do with politics. According to a New York Times article written by Sharon Lafreniere, Polanskaya, quote, has never worked for the Russian government and was introduced to Papadopoulos while discussing an internship with Mifsud. She didn't speak English well enough to fully follow the conversation between Papadopoulos and Mifsud. Furthermore, she's not interested in politics. She can barely tell the difference between Lenin and Stalin, unquote. Mifsud clearly lied to FBI investigators about Polanskaya's identity, in addition to the timeline of his contacts with Papadopoulos in his February 2017 interview. However, unlike Papadopoulos, Mifsud was never indicted. The question is, why? In any case, Mueller continues in his report. In late April 2016, Mifsud told Papadopoulos that he had met with high-level Russian government officials during his recent trip to Moscow. Mifsud said that, on the trip, he learned that the Russians had obtained dirt on candidate Hillary Clinton. As Papadopoulos later stated to the FBI, Mifsud said that the dirt was in the form of emails of Clinton, and that they have thousands of emails. It's important to note that this entire section on Mifsud and Papadopoulos fails to mention that the special counsel, intelligence agencies, the mass media, Democrats, and even anti-Trump Republicans portrayed Mifsud as a Russian agent due to his extensive contacts with Russian officials. However, this claim can easily be disputed. Continuing with the report, Papadopoulos shared information about Russian dirt with people outside of the campaign, and the office investigated whether he also provided it to a campaign official. Papadopoulos and the campaign officials with whom he interacted told the office that they did not recall that Papadopoulos passed them the information. In other words, there is no evidence that establishes Papadopoulos talked to any members of the Trump campaign about the alleged dirt on Clinton. Mueller also states that, quote, Trump campaign officials who interacted or corresponded with Papadopoulos have similarly stated, with varying degrees of certainty, that he did not tell them about the damaging information on Clinton, even though he told someone outside the campaign, namely the former Greek Foreign Minister Nikos Kotzias, during a meeting on May 26, 2016. Perhaps the most curious portion of the report on the Papadopoulos case is when Mueller states that, quote, a different foreign government informed the FBI that 10 days after meeting with Mifsud in late April 2016, Papadopoulos suggested that the Trump campaign had received indications from the Russian government that it could assist the campaign through the anonymous release of information that would be damaging to Hillary Clinton, unquote. It's not clear what this different foreign government Mueller is referring to, but it most likely involves one of the key figures who ultimately triggered Crossfire Hurricane, Alexander Downer, who was Australia's then High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. Nothing about Downer is in Mueller's report, so I'll have to provide the missing details. Papadopoulos was invited to meet with Alexander Downer at an upscale London wine bar in May of 2016. Their conversation was mostly about then-candidate Trump and how he would be like as president in regards to foreign policy. According to Downer, during the meeting, Papadopoulos told him, quote, the Russians might use material that they have on Hillary Clinton in the lead-up to the election, which may be damaging, unquote. At the time, Downer did not think that, quote, the conversation indicated Trump himself had been conspiring with the Russians to collect information on Hillary Clinton, unquote. The meeting seemed to intrigue him because within the next 2 days, Downer reported the details of his encounter with Papadopoulos to the national Australian newspaper, The Australian. 2 months after the interview, Australian officials allegedly informed the FBI of Papadopoulos' meeting with Downer. Or so it appears that's what happened, since it isn't clear how exactly the FBI received this information or why it took 2 months for the FBI to be informed. Interestingly, it was after WikiLeaks dumped hacked emails online in July 2016 that the FBI received the tip on Papadopoulos and the damaging material. Near the end of the article of the Australian newspaper containing Downer's interview, it states that after a period of time, Australia's ambassador to the US, Joe Hockey, passed Downer's information on to Washington. However, according to an investigative report in the Wall Street Journal written by Kimberly Strassel, this claim is inconsistent with a diplomatic source that told her Mr. Downer had conveyed the information to the US Embassy in London and not the FBI, which is highly suspicious. Strassel explains. The US is part of Five Eyes, an intelligence network that includes the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The Five Eyes Agreement provides that any intelligence goes through the intelligence system of the country that gathered it. This helps guarantee information is securely handled, subjected to quality control, and not made prey to political manipulation. Mr. Downer's job was to report his meeting back to Australian intelligence, but we know that it wasn't Australian intelligence that alerted the FBI. Therefore, the document that launched the FBI probe contains no foreign intelligence whatsoever. Here's an audio clip of California Representative Devin Nunes, former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, expressing this similar concern.
If there was any Five Eyes intelligence that was actually used to open this investigation, we'd like to see it because we have yet to see it. Those are all outstanding questions, not to mention the questionable timeline of the briefings that we have had where we know that the counterintelligence investigation was opened in late July. Well, that's fine. So if that's all the information you have, then why are there these other strange activities leading up to late July, particularly in the spring?
I was trying to understand this because you broke the news on this program more than a month ago that you've looked for reasons and catalysts to understand how an investigation was opened and launched into the Trump campaign. And you said to us, based on the Five Eyes intelligence of all of our partners across the world, that there was no intelligence that you could find that was launched that investigation. And yet here you have your colleague, Trey Gowdy, saying the FBI did the right thing. So I'm trying to understand where the disconnect is.
Well, I think on what Trey Gowdy's saying, and we got to be very careful because the media's tried to make a bigger deal about this than what it is. What Trey Gowdy's specifically talking about is this small slice of the investigation that we're looking at as it relates to whether or not an informant or informants were used. And there's new information actually this week that the media is ignoring. So the New York Times has reported in the past that the Australian ambassador, Australian High Commissioner, is the one that brought this to the attention of the United States government. Now, typically that would have gone through FBI channels. It would have went through the embassy in London and it would have came across officially.
And it didn't.
Across the pond officially. And it didn't. And that's what we would like to have seen. Now, this week, we now know that Mr. Downer, the former Australian ambassador, High Commissioner in London, said that he had given the information to the Australian ambassador in the U.S. Well, now we know that that's not true. So Mr. Downer now has claimed that in an Australian newspaper, but we now know from sources that have now spoke to different media outlets, the Australians are denying that that's how this happened, that the Australian ambassador in the United States had nothing to do with this. And quite frankly, that's what we want our partners in Australia to do. We don't think that they should be investigating or looking into political campaigns and then willy-nilly throwing that information over to the U.S. government and then opening investigations into political campaigns. That's not what we want to see.
No Five Eyes intelligence alerted the FBI because Downer, for some unknown reason, breached diplomatic protocol and never reported his meeting with Papadopoulos to Australian intelligence. Instead, Downer's so-called tip somehow made its way to the Obama State Department. As Strassel writes, quote, "The Downer details landed with Elizabeth Dibble, the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in London, who previously served as a Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in Mrs. Clinton's State Department." Unquote. It isn't clear what happened next. Did Downer's tip continue to funnel throughout the State Department team, who were already encouraging the Russia-Trump collusion narrative? Nonetheless, Downer's tip launched the July 31st FBI counterintelligence investigation on the basic premise or factual basis that in May 2016, a Russian spy named Mifsud told Papadopoulos about hacked Democratic emails that would damage Hillary Clinton. But the premise is unsound for three reasons. One, there is no direct evidence that Mifsud is a Russian spy. Two, Papadopoulos claims he doesn't even recall talking to Downer about these so-called hacked emails or even so-called dirt. In fact, Downer himself said in an interview that, quote, "Papadopoulos did not say dirt. He said material that could be damaging to her. No, he said it would be damaging. He didn't say what it was," unquote. In other words, no hacked emails were mentioned in the conversation. And three, the FBI never received official intelligence from Five Eyes, but instead an unverified tip from an unknown source about a low-level Trump campaign advisor who was told that Russians had something that might be damaging to Clinton. Is this vague information sufficient evidence to justify a full investigation into collusion by the Trump campaign, considering it wasn't until January 2017 when Papadopoulos told FBI investigators that Mifsud mentioned thousands of emails?
You're listening to ASP Stuff Radio.
Let's examine some of the reasons why Joseph Mifsud is not likely a Russian spy or agent, but rather a Western intelligence asset, in other words, an FBI, CIA, or MI6 agent. If these reasons are compelling, then the Trump-Russia conspiracy theory was probably initiated by the employment of a spy trap, an investigative method to trick or set up various Trump campaign officials into saying or doing things that would inadvertently establish a dubious connection with Russia, thereby reinforcing the collusion narrative. 1. Misfit has denied the allegation that he's a Russian spy in an Italian newspaper called Repubblica, where he said, quote, "Secret agent? I never got a penny from the Russians. My conscience is clean," unquote. Of course, he could be lying, but there's also no direct evidence to support the claim that Mifsud is a Russian spy. 2. Mifsud used to work as the director of the International Relations Department at Link Campus University in Rome, which has a strong history of the CIA and FBI working there. In 2012, he was working with Claire Smith, a member of the UK Joint Intelligence Committee, on a training program for the Italian military and law enforcement at Link Campus University. 3. Mifsud has worked with friendly nations and has close public ties to Western governments, politicians, and institutions, including the CIA, FBI, and other British intelligence services. 4. If Mifsud was a Russian spy, then according to Chris Blackburn, a UK political analyst, Peter Strzok, an FBI agent working on the Mifsud case, quote, should have found a few major red flags that would bring his motives into question, especially since counterintelligence investigations would require FBI agents to look into a person of interest's family, friends, colleagues, debts, holidays, neighbors, romances, hobbies. They go through a person's biography with a fine-tooth comb to look for patterns and trends, unquote. 5. If Mifsud was a Russian spy, and given that he told Papadopoulos about Russians having dirt on Clinton in the form of emails, then why didn't the FBI detain or arrest Mifsud when they interviewed him in February 2017, less than 2 weeks after they talked to Papadopoulos on January 27th? And this raises another mystery, as pointed out by Devin Nunes. Quote, how did the FBI know to ask Papadopoulos specifically about Clinton's emails if the FBI had not yet spoken with Mifsud? Finally, George Papadopoulos claimed that Mifsud was not a Russian agent and that the FBI fabricated the entire Russia collusion conspiracy. And here's a clip of Papadopoulos making this claim.
From day one, I knew this entire thing was a hoax. Unfortunately, I just couldn't speak. I basically had a gag order on me until I was sentenced. And
so when they were probing you, asking you questions about collusion, if there was no collusion, no actual crime, they have no evidence of collusion, and yet you got in trouble because you said something that was not right to the FBI.
Yeah, my story is, there's been so much misinformation about actually what my real case was all about. And just to really simplify it for the viewers, it was about a professor I met in London who the FBI told the world was a Russian agent. This guy is no Russian agent.
Who is he?
Joseph Mifsud is his name. I met this individual through an intermediary who represents the FBI in the UK. And I met him at a university in Rome, which the CIA and the FBI holds various symposiums at. Mm-hmm. So I never expected him to be some sort of Russian agent. And then one day this person tells me that the Russians have Hillary Clinton's emails out of the blue.
Who is this?
Joseph Mifsud.
Say, hey, I got Hillary Clinton's email.
Yeah, he tells me the Russians have Hillary Clinton's emails. I don't believe him. This was not a credible person. So basically what the FBI wanted me to do, and what Mueller was trying to, I guess, force me to admit, even though it never happened, was who did I tell on the campaign about what this guy told me? Because if I had told somebody on the campaign this entire
collusion,
it would have been a collusion conspiracy, but it would have been based on Western intelligence, basically fabricating the entire thing, and that's why the case is insane.
This is a remarkable revelation because it would answer the question of how Alexander Downer's tip made its way to the FBI. Mifsud, who was secretly working for the FBI or CIA, converses with Papadopoulos and offers him bait with the intent to establish a pretense of collusion. When Papadopoulos mentioned this alleged dirt or damaging information on Clinton directly to Downer, who possibly has ties with Western intelligence as well, the information would therefore technically count as official intelligence and sufficiently establish an FBI counterintelligence investigation. Papadopoulos' testimony would also explain why Mifsud was never charged for perjury. He was part of an interagency operation. Mifsud was not the only spy working for Western intelligence in order to collect information and entrap members of the Trump team. In early May of this year, 2019, the New York Times reported that in September 2016, the FBI under the Obama administration sent an informant or honey trap under the fake alias Azra Turk, a Turkish woman, to meet with Papadopoulos. Azra Turk posed as a research assistant to Stefan Halper, a Cambridge University professor and a longtime FBI informant. Halper had contacted Papadopoulos through email, offering him $3,000 to fly to London and write an academic research paper on Mediterranean Sea energy issues. At some point during one of their meetings, Halper and Turk individually asked Papadopoulos whether he had any knowledge of Russian hacking operations.
Briefly describe your experience with the woman you believe was sent to spy on the Trump campaign by the Obama administration.
I received an unsolicited email in September of 2016 from a man named Stefan Halper, who was suggesting that he wanted to pay me $3,000 to write a report on energy security questions that I was a recognized expert on at the time in Israel, Turkey, and Cyprus. And I looked him up. I'd never heard of him before. I just saw that he had worked in 4 U.S. administrations, and he was a professor at Cambridge. So I accepted his offer. He flew me to London, where he paid a 5-star hotel, my flight. And he said, before I meet with you, I need you to meet my assistant. And he put this assistant in an email chain along with me. And I saw her name was Azra Turk. I recognized it as Turkish, which was a bit suspicious right away because my policy positions throughout my entire career were very hostile to Turkey. So when I noticed a Turkish name, I didn't understand why she'd be involved. But anyways, I went and I met with her, and she was very suggestive, as you can understand. Younger, very flirtatious, and I right away understood that this wasn't a Cambridge assistant. And, she barely spoke English, she was very flirty, and was trying to do 2 things. One, to extract information about my professional connections in the Middle East, and 2, to see if I had any information that she could potentially extract for me about Trump in Russia, which of course is nonsense. And so anyways, after I meet with her, she is then introduced to me again the next day with Stefan Halper, where she goes from this suggestive young lady to now pouring us coffee. And Stefan Halper is very belligerent, how he invited me to basically castigate me about my policy positions. And of course, Azra Turk then took me to dinner and was just basically trying to extract information. I was very suspicious. And, from that moment, I knew there was something wrong, and I was laughing about it. But now, of course, the New York Times reported that she was some sort of agent, but I don't think she was FBI, I think she was CIA.
But she was dispatched by the Obama administration. Barack Obama was the president of the United States, led the executive branch, including CIA and FBI and every other agency, to spy on, in effect, the Trump campaign. Am I missing something, or is that what happened?
That's absolutely what happened, and I want to make something very clear here. I don't think President Trump was tweeting about UK interference out of the blue for no reason last week, because let me explain why. The day I met with Stefan Halper and Azra Turk in London, I was invited by the British Ministry of Foreign Affairs to meet with them at their offices, including with Tobias Ellwood, who was the number 2 at the time under Boris Johnson. So clearly, when the New York Times suggested in their reporting today that the British were told of this operation, I believe the British actually were actively spying on me as well. And I think part of what President Trump was tweeting last week about the British spying was about this involvement in this operation in London. So I guess we have a lot more to find out.
To be clear, the government's use of informants is not illegal, but it does come at the cost of violating our Fourth Amendment right to privacy. Furthermore, even though it is legally permissible for the FBI to use informants in investigations, there are specific guidelines issued by the Attorney General that determine whether the conduct of informants is criminal. Between 2011 and 2014, according to one study that was reported by the Daily Dot, the FBI authorized informants to break the law 22,800 times within a 4-year period. In other words, despite the Attorney General guidelines, the FBI made exceptions to what would otherwise have been a crime. Of course, even if informants are legally allowed and their conduct conforms with the guidelines, the degree of spying and infiltration run by Australian, UK, and US intelligence agencies on a presidential campaign is historically unprecedented, gravely immoral, and illegal if the execution was politically motivated and founded on a complete fabrication. More specifically, if there was no credible or verified evidence that would even warrant a preliminary investigation to surveil the Trump campaign, in other words, prior to opening a full investigation and only during a threat assessment, then spying, no matter what surveillance tactic is used, is unquestionably illegal. Another way to put it, according to the former Secret Service agent Dan Bongino in his book Spygate, quote, "Law enforcement is tasked with investigating crimes in search of the people who did it. They do not examine people in search of crimes. If people were the focus and not the crimes, then nearly every person in the country would be found guilty of violating some law." I will play the rest of the first Papadopoulos clip in which he reveals 2 shocking pieces of information about his meeting with Alexander Downer.
Just to be clear, Stefan Halper, they told you were a Russian agent, is giving you information. You go to a bar and you meet this Ambassador Downer and you have a casual conversation at what happened with Ambassador Downer, and he's talking to you. Is he trying to get information out of you?
Yeah, so just to put some context about Alexander Downer, so I was one of 4 witnesses that was invited to testify in front of the Oversight Committee last year in front of Mark Meadows and John Radcliffe. The other 3 were Jim Comey, Sally Yates, and Loretta Lynch. And people were scratching their heads. Why would George Papadopoulos be among one of those 4 names about FISA abuse? And during my conversations or testimony in front of that committee, the name Alexander Downer came up a lot. And he came up within the context of this guy was probably spying on me. And he wasn't there acting like a friendly diplomat looking to pass along potentially national security sensitive info, but he was there to basically sabotage me and the campaign. And just to be clear, I never remember talking about dirt with this person. He's actually contradicted himself numerous times.
So you say you got drunk and you started telling him how Hillary Clinton's emails and all this story.
Yeah, I mean, that's a complete lie. I mean, he's even come out and said we had 1 drink each. And that's the truth. Now, something that people don't know, and I've never shared it with anyone except right now, is that I actually reported Alexander Downer to both the FBI and Bob Mueller. Because of his very bizarre, strange behavior during my meeting with him, where he was pulling his phone out, he was recording me. It was just very bizarre.
Well, and so you did the right thing.
There are 2 things that are concerning from Papadopoulos' testimony. First, if Papadopoulos did in fact report Downer to the FBI and Bob Mueller, then why was Downer's name left out of the report completely? And not just his name, but all of the details about the meeting. This leads to the second revelation. If Papadopoulos is correct that he never told Downer about Mifsud, mentioning that the Russians had dirt on Clinton, then Downer lied about Papadopoulos telling him about the damaging information. But then, if Downer did not hear about the dirt from Papadopoulos, then how did Downer obtain the tip? Did Downer already know about the dirt, and the arranged meeting was just another setup to entrap Papadopoulos to secure the collusion narrative? According to Papadopoulos' testimony, both Mifsud and Downer were spying on him, so it's likely this may have been a spy trap. If only Mueller's report would shed more light on this issue. Unfortunately, it fails to mention whether the FBI even interrogated Downer, the one guy that initiated the Trump-Russia investigation. even though it has been reported elsewhere that FBI agents, including Peter Strzok, had flown to London to interview Downer only days after the probe opened in August 2016. But again, this is not mentioned in Mueller's report.
You're listening to ASP Stuff Radio.
Before I conclude this section of my report, I want to reveal several suspicious facts about Mifsud and Downer. With respect to Mifsud, 1. Papadopoulos was introduced to Mifsud by an FBI intermediary named Arvinder Sambai, who was working as the FBI's counsel in the UK and had a personal and professional relationship with Bob Mueller, dating back to 9/11. 2. Mifsud was quoted in an Italian newspaper saying that, quote, "I am a member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And you know which is the only foundation I am a member of? The Clinton Foundation. Between you and me, my thinking is left-leaning." Unquote. He must have said this in jest because he is not a member of the Clinton Foundation, even though he has made a couple of $250 donations to the foundation. 3. Mifsud worked with Gianni Petea, a strong Clinton supporter and member of European Parliament. She was reported in Time magazine saying that she has, quote, "taken the unprecedented step of endorsing and campaigning for Clinton because the risk of Donald Trump is too high," unquote. In light of these facts, if Mifsud is a Clinton supporter and leans left on the political spectrum, then why would he make every effort to offer dirt on Clinton, which would only damage her chances of winning the 2016 US presidential election? In regards to Alexander Downer, 1. In 2006, he signed an agreement to provide $25 million from the Australian government to help the Clinton Foundation fight AIDS. The donation is certainly, without a doubt, for a great moral cause, but it has been claimed that the money was mishandled by the foundation. In any case, the agreement was that the grant money would spread out over 4 years for a project to provide screening and drug treatment to AIDS patients in Asia. The Clinton Foundation would end up receiving over $88 million from the Australian Treasury between 2006 and 2014. 2. Downer joined the advisory board of London-based Hackloit & Company. Hackloit was founded by former MI6 agents, British intelligence operatives with deep connections throughout the world, who provide investigative research for governments and large corporations, similar to Fusion GPS in America. Mike Reynolds, a founding member of Hackloit, is a close friend of Sir Richard Dearlove, who is also an associate of Christopher Steele. Hackloit has various associations with government and intelligence agencies, as well as consulting firms. One of those firms is Kissinger McClarty Associates, an international strategic advisory firm that has branched into 2 separate groups, one of which, Kissinger Associates, has lobbied on behalf of Russia's state-owned nuclear company and has donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Clinton Foundation between 2008 and 2016. According to Henry Williams, a member of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, the firm's, quote, "style appears to be similar to the Steele dossier. Clients pay for pages of well-sourced prose from Hackloit contacts across the globe," unquote. As reported, several of Hackloit's U.S. representatives made substantial contributions to Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. Although Downer resigned from the board in 2014, quote, "his information and connections continued uninterrupted," unquote. In fact, in early 2016, Downer was reported to have, quote, "attended a 2-day country retreat at the invitation for the group, which has been involved in a number of corporate spy scandals in recent times." These are important facts from which we can draw a number of conclusions. But all that we do know is that Downer, a high official Australian diplomat, was involved in donations to the Clinton Foundation and is connected to a secretive firm that also has ties to the Clinton campaign and various Western intelligence agencies. Downer shows up at a London bar to talk to Papadopoulos, a volunteer for the Trump campaign who was told by Mifsud, a mysterious FBI or CIA agent, also a Clinton supporter, that Russians have damaging material on Clinton. 2 months later, the DNC servers were allegedly hacked by Russians, and Australian intelligence allegedly reported that information to the FBI.
All we did was report what Papadopoulos said, and that was that he thought the Russians might release information that could be damaging to Hillary Clinton's campaign at some stage before the election. Now, he didn't have to tell me that. I didn't go to the meeting thinking he was going to even mention Russia in a context like the election campaign. I had no idea what he would say. He chose to say that to me. I have no idea why he was blabbering this. I don't know why he told me this, but he did, and we reported it, and the rest is history. But there's no defense for him saying it's some sort of weird conspiracy. I mean, it's what he told me.
That was Downer alleging that Papadopoulos told him about Russians having damaging information on Clinton. Part 6. Real Collusion. The Fabricated Steele Dossier. Although the Papadopoulos case triggered the opening of the original FBI counterintelligence investigation of Russian efforts to influence the 2016 presidential election, the notorious Steele dossier served as another foundational component in determining whether there was coordination between Trump's campaign and the Russian government. The dossier would later be used as primary evidence to obtain a FISA warrant on Carter Page, a former foreign policy advisor to Trump. The term dossier is from French meaning bundle of papers. Steele's dossier is essentially a 35-page collection of research memos, some of them salacious, alleging, among other things, that there was collusion between Trump's campaign and Russia. On page 1 of the document, it begins with the first summary. Russian regime has been cultivating, supporting, and assisting Trump for at least 5 years. Aim, endorsed by Russian President Vladimir Putin, has been to encourage splits in division in Western alliance. It further claims that Trump and his inner circle have accepted, quote, a regular flow of intelligence from the Kremlin, including on his Democratic and other political rivals, Hillary Clinton, unquote, and that Russia had enough negative information on Trump to blackmail him. How did this controversial compendium get compiled? From October 2015 to May 2016, the Washington Free Beacon, an American conservative political journalism website, hired Fusion GPS, a political opposition research firm, to conduct research on multiple candidates during the GOP primary, including Donald Trump. Although it's not clear who exactly paid for this research, one of the major donors of the Free Beacon was Paul Singer, a hedge fund manager and supporter of then Republican candidate Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, Trump's rival at the time. It is not uncommon nor illegal for political parties to pay American companies to acquire dirt on their opponents. The Free Beacon eventually stopped funding their Oppo research when Trump won the Republican nomination in July of 2016. However, the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee, or DNC, had also hired Fusion GPS to conduct negative research on Trump, his businesses and associates, as well as possible connections with Russia. Their funding of Fusion GPS's research lasted from April through the end of October 2016, several days before the election in early November. The DNC hired a lawyer named Mark E. Elias, who works at a law firm, Perkins Coie, that represents the DNC and the Clinton campaign. It was Elias who hired Fusion GPS, who in turn paid and enlisted a former British intelligence officer, Christopher Steele, to produce the dossier, hence the infamous Steele dossier. In 2009, Steele co-founded Orbis Business Intelligence, a London-based private intelligence firm. This is relevant to note because given that Steele was a former spy, he had no diplomatic protection, and therefore he could not safely travel to Russia to do the research on his own. Instead, Steele's Orbis Business Intelligence had clients in Russia at the time, and they would hire native Russian contacts to communicate with Russian informants to do the work for Steele. According to the New York Times, quote, "As a former spy who had carried out espionage inside Russia, Mr. Steele was in no position to travel to Moscow to study Mr. Trump's connections there. Instead, he hired native Russian speakers to call informants inside Russia and made surreptitious contact with his own connections in the country as well," unquote. Indeed, Steele paid Russian sources and used third parties to talk to them. In the dossier, some of those sources are anonymous, listed as, quote, "Source A senior Russian foreign ministry figure, and Source B, a former top intelligence officer still active inside the Kremlin," unquote. The former acting CIA deputy director under the Obama administration, Michael Morell, confirmed that, quote, "Mr. Steele paid the Russian intelligence sources who provided the information and never met them directly," unquote. In fact, Steele spoke with his sources through intermediaries. When asked in an interview about his thoughts on the veracity of the dossier, Morell said, quote, "Unless you know the sources, and unless you know how a particular source acquired a particular piece of information, you cannot judge the information. You just can't," unquote. Morell continues. "And then I asked myself, why did these guys provide this information? What was their motivation? And I subsequently learned that he paid them, that the intermediaries paid the sources, and the intermediaries got the money from Steele. And that kind of worries me a little bit, because if you're paying somebody, particularly former FSB officers, essentially the FBI of Russia, they are going to tell you truth and innuendo and rumor, and they're going to call you up and say, hey, let's have another meeting, I have more information for you, because they want to get paid some more. I think you've got to take all of that into consideration when you consider the dossier," unquote. Michael Morell expressed strong doubt on the allegations that members of the Trump campaign colluded with Russia, even though he endorsed Hillary Clinton during the 2016 presidential election. Collusion. What is collusion? The word is from Latin collidere, literally meaning to play together. The term can mean different things in different contexts. For example, Larry can secretly meet with his friends and plan a big birthday celebration for his spouse, where everyone agrees to deceive and lie to her to prevent her from knowing about the birthday party. This is an innocent case of collusion, so it's not illegal to engage in this kind of activity. Mueller's report makes it clear that the act of collusion itself is not a criminal charge. He says, collusion is not a specific offense or theory of liability found in the United States Code, nor is it a term of art in federal criminal law. For those reasons, the office's focus in analyzing questions of joint criminal liability was on conspiracy as defined in federal law. In other words, within a criminal context of conspiracy, collusion can be illegal. Mueller then explicates conspiracy as defined in federal law: an agreement to commit any substantive violation of federal criminal law, including foreign influence and campaign finance laws. Legal experts agree that collusion is not a specific federal crime, unless it is conducted in an unlawful manner. Richard Hasen, University of California Irvine School of Law, states that federal law prevents campaigns from soliciting contributions from foreign individuals, end quote. Even non-legal experts such as Paul Rosenzweig, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Homeland Security, states that unlawful collusion under the pretext of conspiracy occurs when two parties violate election laws of the United States, such as the prohibition of foreign nationals from contributing anything of value to an electoral campaign. And the Federal Election Commission specifically emphasizes that, quote, campaigns are prohibited from accepting contributions from foreign nations, unquote. In his report, Mueller provides examples of contributions that would qualify as a thing of value to an election campaign, namely, quote, candidate-related opposition research given to a campaign for the purpose of influencing an election, unquote. This, he says, quote, could constitute a contribution to which the foreign source ban could apply, unquote. With this refined definition of unlawful collusion, we can clearly see a case in which this illegal act occurred. Since the Clinton campaign and the DNC paid Fusion GPS, a firm that specializes in opposition research, and Fusion GPS paid Christopher Steele, who once said he, quote, was desperate that Trump not get elected and was passionate about him not being president, unquote. And Steele paid Russian government officials or foreign nations. It follows that Clinton's campaign and the DNC paid foreign nations to get opposition dirt and damaging information, a thing of value, to smear Trump and in essence to influence the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Is this not a clear violation of an election law of the United States? After all, Steele had close ties with foreign Russian informants, and if the Russian government is permitting people to be paid to deliver opposition research to Hillary Clinton and the DNC with the goal of influencing an election in America against Trump, then how is that not unlawful collusion, coordination, and conspiracy?
Frankly, I think something that may make sense is looking at the Democrat National Committee coordinated opposition research directly with the Ukrainian embassy. This is not an accusation, that's an on-the-record action that they took. So if you're looking for an example of a campaign coordinating with a foreign country or a foreign source, look no further than the DNC, who actually coordinated opposition research with the Ukrainian embassy. And no one in this room, to my knowledge, really had a big problem with that.
You're listening to ASP Stuff Radio.
Consider another case of Clinton-Russia collusion. According to the testimony of Nellie Orr, former CIA contractor and Fusion GPS employee, and wife of Bruce Orr, the Associate Deputy Attorney General of the DOJ, Fusion GPS was using Serhiy Leshchenko, a former member of the Ukrainian parliament and investigative journalist, as a major source for their opposition research. Ukrainian American and DNC operative Alexander Chalupa would also contribute in the opposition research by meeting with individuals in the Ukrainian government to gather information that would be damaging to Trump's former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, and therefore Trump. Leshchenko was responsible for exposing Paul Manafort's corrupt financial transactions with Ukrainian businesses. In an August 2016 interview, Leshchenko told the Financial Times that, quote, a Trump presidency would change the pro-Ukrainian agenda in American foreign policy. For me, it was important to know not only the corruption aspect, but that he, Trump, is a pro-Russian candidate who can break the geopolitical balance in the world, unquote. Leshchenko also stated that Ukrainian politicians, including himself, were on Hillary Clinton's side. Given Leshchenko's anti-Trump sentiments, his motivation was in alignment with the conspiratorial efforts of the DNC to take Trump down by reinforcing the collusion narrative. Fortunately, Ukrainian's top prosecutor, Yuri Lutsenko, has opened an investigation into whether his country's law enforcement intentionally and illegally leaked Manafort's financial records during the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Lastly, according to an investigative report written by Jeff Carlson of the Epoch Times, an independent journalist organization, one of the key figures of the Mueller investigation into alleged collusion between the Trump campaign and Moscow is Oleg Deripaska. a Russian oligarch who has close ties with Vladimir Putin. But he also has other ties. For instance, Deripaska paid Adam Waldman, an American Washington lawyer and consultant who represented Christopher Steele, $562,000 for so-called legal services for Deripaska's company, UC Rusal, the world's second-largest aluminum company. Waldman is also Deripaska's primary lawyer and lobbyist. Who else was lobbying on behalf of Deripaska? Christopher Steele, the same former British intelligence officer who was working for Clinton and the DNC to compile the dossier. This naturally raises the question about Deripaska's role in the creation of the Steele dossier and its connection with Democratic partisans. After all, in a series of texts, Waldman had been corresponding with Mark Warner, the top Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, about Steele and Deripaska. These three cases of real unlawful collusion are appalling and undermines the integrity of the Democratic Party, considering that on May 1st, 2019 of this year, attorney William Barr testified before a Senate Judiciary Committee that the Steele dossier may have been part of a Russian disinformation campaign. Disinformation is defined as, quote, false information that is intended to mislead, especially propaganda issued by a government organization, unquote. If Barr is correct that the Steele dossier was a byproduct of Russia propaganda, this would implicate the Clinton campaign, the DNC, and various DOJ and Democratic officials, since they were complicit in the fabrication and illegal leaking of the dossier. Interesting how the Clinton campaign was doing the exact same thing that they were accusing the Trump campaign of doing, except there's actual evidence to prove the former is guilty of unlawful collusion. Here's a statement from an April 2019 opinion piece for The Washington Post. Our election was corrupted, our democracy assaulted, our sovereignty and security violated. Well, this is loaded with irony because it was none other than Hillary Clinton who said this.
And it's a story that needs to be told and retold over and over again because we were the subject of an attack on our election, an attack on our sovereignty, an attack on our democracy.
Several days after William Barr released his summary of Mueller's conclusions of his report, 9 Republican members of the House Intelligence Committee called for Democratic Chairman Adam Schiff to resign because he always insisted that there was, quote, more than circumstantial evidence that Trump's campaign colluded with Russia. That was a bold claim because we now know that there was not even direct evidence of collusion. Listen carefully to Schiff's response to those members requesting that he resign.
My colleagues may think it's okay that the Russians offered dirt on a Democratic candidate for president as part of what was described as the Russian government's effort to help the Trump campaign. You might think that's okay. My colleagues might think it's okay that when that was offered to the son of the president, who had a pivotal role in the campaign, that the president's son did not call the FBI. He did not adamantly refuse that foreign help. No, instead, that son said that he would love the help of the Russians. You might think it's okay that he took that meeting. You might think it's okay that they concealed it from the public. You might think it's okay that their only disappointment after that meeting was that the dirt they received on Hillary Clinton wasn't better. You might think that's okay. You might think it's okay that the campaign chairman of a presidential campaign would offer information about that campaign to a Russian oligarch in exchange for money or debt forgiveness. You might think that's okay. I don't. You might think that it's okay that the president's son-in-law sought to establish a secret back channel of communications with the Russians through a Russian diplomatic facility. You might say that's all okay. You might say that's just what you need to do to win. But I don't think it's okay. I think it's immoral. I think it's unethical. I think it's unpatriotic. And yes, I think it's corrupt and evidence of collusion.
Just flip the script. Adam Schiff is essentially describing what the Clinton campaign and the DNC are guilty of: unlawful collusion, coordination and conspiracy efforts with the Russian government to influence an election, with a play on Schiff's words. You may think that it's okay that the Clinton campaign paid Fusion GPS to enlist Christopher Steele, a former British intelligence officer, to get dirt on Trump and compile a dossier by contacting a senior Russian foreign ministry official and former top intelligence officers in the Kremlin. You think it's okay? But I don't think it's okay. I think it's immoral. I think it's unethical. I think it's unpatriotic. And yes, I think it's corrupt and evidence of collusion. This is a classic case of what Sigmund Freud calls psychological projection, where you resort to the defensive mechanism of denying in yourself the existence of unacceptable behavior while attributing that same behavior to others. If you are lying, accuse your opponent of being a liar. If you are racist, accuse your opponent of being a racist. If you're colluding with the Russians, accuse your opponent of colluding with the Russians. In general, if you have something to hide, accuse your opponent of it. This fallacious yet persuasive tactic is not uncommon in the political arena. Paul Joseph Goebbels, a German Nazi politician, is well known for his public speaking skills and his interest in the use of propaganda to promote the Nazi Party. One of Goebbels' famous quotes is from a 1934 speech at the Nuremberg Rally, where he talks about foreign propaganda in World War I. We learned the consequences of our neglect all too clearly during the World War. While the enemy states produced unprecedented atrocity propaganda aimed at Germany throughout the whole world, we did nothing and were completely defenseless against it. Only when enemy foreign propaganda had nearly won over the greater part even of the neutral states did the German government begin to sense the enormous power of propaganda. It was too late. Just as we were militarily and economically unprepared for the war, so also with propaganda. We lost the war in this area more than in any other. The cleverest trick used in propaganda against Germany during the war was to accuse Germany of what our enemies themselves were doing. The cleverest trick used in propaganda by the Democratic Party was to accuse their political opponent, the Trump campaign, of what they themselves are guilty of doing. Part 7. The Unverified Dossier. The next issue to address concerns the credibility of the allegations contained in the Steele dossier. Sometime in January 2017, Richard Engel, NBC's news chief foreign correspondent, one of the very few respectable mainstream investigative American journalists, emphatically states as a guest on Rachel Maddow's show that he couldn't find any evidence to corroborate the allegations in the Steele dossier.
There have been a lot of allegations, I would even call them rumors at this stage, that the Russians put together a file on Donald Trump, compromising material, compromising him financially, compromising him personally.
Stuff that he did that was bad, that they had documentation of.
That they caught him on trips to Russia and neighboring states doing nefarious things, and that they have evidence to back it up, and that he effectively fell victim to a Russian trap. This is the allegation, and that they've assembled this file of compromising information on him, and that they're just waiting at any moment to either use it or use it to blackmail him so that he is sort of a puppet. I've heard these allegations for a long time. I've heard very, very specific allegations, times, places, amounts of money, specific activities. I haven't been able to prove any of it.
You've been chasing this story to see if you can document it.
I've called people in Russia. I've called leading experts. I've tried to chase it down in this country. And I'm not the only one. Other reporters have been given this kind of material and have been looking into it and haven't been able to prove it. And I called some of the sources who were sending this my way, and I said, okay, you have this material. You say it's as compromising as it is. Show me the proof. Show me these tapes that supposedly exist. Show me the records of the money that was supposedly paid. All of these things, these allegations that, if true, would be incredibly compromising. So far, I haven't been able to find anything.
In hindsight, Mueller could have saved millions of American taxpayer dollars if he only talked with Richard Engel, who already said back in January 2017 that the claims in the dossier could not be validated. It turns out that Engel was right all along. If, as Engel and Mueller have shown, that there are numerous unverified allegations that characterize Trump as having been compromised by Russia, then how did the dossier receive the credibility that justified the FBI's application for a FISA warrant to wiretap and electronically surveil Carter Page, Trump's then foreign policy advisor? Here's a clip from the Epoch Times, where senior investigative reporter Joshua Phillip interviews a 27-year veteran FBI field agent, Mark Ruskin. Ruskin explains why he thinks the dossier gained the undeserved credibility that it did.
Here you have a document based in large part on open source information available on the internet, which had unverified and virtually unsubstantiated allegations. It was by circulating enough times, it assumed a credibility which was undeserved, and in particular because individuals supposedly of high stature vouched for it. In particular, I would suggest that the former CIA director is really at fault for lending credibility for having it attached to an intelligence report, which was a legitimate intelligence report, but by cohabitating together, the credibility of the intelligence report, let's say, kind of overflowed onto this document that everyone is calling a dossier instead of a file. So it was a kind of Brennan very significantly contributed for no underlying purpose that can be articulated other than political animosity, which he holds for the president. And that started the snowball to roll. And like any other snowball, as it rolls, it gathers momentum and becomes larger and larger until it hits a tree, like the Mueller report.
According to Mark Ruskin, because the unverified and unclassified document was circulating throughout the mainstream media, it gradually received undeserved credibility. However, when someone with the authority, like the former CIA director John Brennan, the same guy who accused Trump of betraying the United States, vouched for and included the dossier in a classified intelligence community report on Russian interference in the 2016 elections, the dossier gained even stronger credibility, which eventually led to a full-blown yet absolutely baseless investigation, since there was no sufficient credible allegations in the dossier. That is, the allegations in a negative opposition research document was not fully vetted for accuracy during a threat assessment and prior to a preliminary investigation. Ruskin points out that the standard protocol for initiating a preliminary investigation, much less a full-blown investigation, is that there first needs to be some basic, credible evidence of a crime or pressing official intelligence before requesting a task force of officers, agents, and intelligence operators to engage in a secret operation, not the other way around. You don't first gather a task force and then collect evidence, for that would be an abuse of power and intelligence weaponized against innocent Americans. If you enjoy our show, please support us at aspstuffradio.com or directly at paypal.me/ASPstuffradio. Donate. Thank you for your support and thank you for listening. listening.